Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson.
Today's guest is Ben Peppi, the head of sport at Barn Door in London. Ben is brokering and negotiating commercial deals with athletes, brands, and sport rights holders. Barn Door is a platform that connects professional sports stars to exciting business opportunities. He has worked together with several athletes, one of which the boxer Anthony Joshua. What is athlete IP? How good of a golfer is Ben actually? All of this and more in today's episode with Ben Peppi.
Ben Peppi, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Marcus?
All is well here. And I'm very happy to talk to you. You are the head of sports law services at JMW. So can you tell us a little bit about that role and what you do?
Absolutely. So as you said, I'm head of sports services at JMW Solicitors. We are a full service national law firm in the UK. We have 3 offices across the country, head office being in Manchester, where we have circa 450 people. I work out of our London office that we opened in May of 2019, so just coming up to 3 years ago. There's now 130 of us there, and we have a satellite office in Liverpool. Within my role is kind of split into 2 things really. So one, as you alluded to, I'm head of sports services within the law firm. What that essentially entails is 2 things really. So I co-lead our sports work as a business. So I mentioned that we're a full service law firm, which means that we do everything across the board. So we act for talent on the private client side of things, whether it's buying them houses, whether it's helping them with their wills, trust, estate planning, whether it's their prenuptial agreements and so on, all the way through to working on the corporate and commercial side within sport, obviously with football clubs, with national governing bodies, with agencies, more recently with sports technology businesses, doing everything from their corporate work, commercial work, IP, employment, litigation, and so on. So I kind of oversee our sports work. I actually sit alongside our legal team in a commercial advisory capacity. So when we're working on deals, it's typically me managing, brokering, negotiating those deals. And then I will bring in our legal team to do relevant, obviously, drafting of contracts. And then the other side, obviously, is as leading the team, I help to grow our business within sport. So that's kind of the JMW side. And then I'm sure we'll talk about the Barn Door side a little down the line.
Yeah, we can stay on the JMW for now.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned contracts. We have had a few guests previously that are sports lawyers that have talked about the process. So the listeners, I think, are a little bit familiar with the topic at least. But anything that you can tell us now coming out of the pandemic, how has that been working? Has there been any, force majeure issues or anything specific with regards to the legal work now during the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think, what's been interesting coming out of the pandemic is that I think it's kind of gone in 2 phases really. So obviously there was almost the initial kind of emergency work and the initial worry around what's going to happen to current contracts that were in place when the pandemic first hit. It was obviously an unprecedented situation, and there were clubs, there were governing bodies, there were events, there were rights holders who were all of a sudden looking at their contractual situation, as well as obviously sponsors, brands, talent, and so on and so forth. Looking at what was going to happen, you obviously mentioned the obvious one, which was force majeure. And I mean, the whole time that I've worked in the industry, a pandemic has obviously never factored into a force majeure event, whereas now it did. So I think, so the initial phase was very much kind of reactive, which was, as I said, which was kind of the emergency review of current situations, given everything that was going on, given that sport shut down, as we know, for a significant amount of time, and what that ultimately meant for broadcast, media, sponsors, etc., etc. And then the second phase of that is obviously the more proactive element, which is mitigating against that risk moving forward. So as we know, the pandemic isn't over. We've seen 3 waves so far, and it seems like we're obviously now thankfully coming out the other side, but clearly we don't know what's around the corner. So it was almost that kind of trigger event of the COVID-19 pandemic meant that for kind of future contracts, you are now seeing additional wording obviously put into that force majeure element. And also clubs, brands, rights holders, events, etc., all looking at their contracts in a slightly more nuanced way, I would suggest, and also looking at it through the lens of what ifs and what might happen around things like pandemics, but also other kind of things that might come from left field that we haven't kind of even thought about in the past, but all of a sudden, given the significant loss of revenues across the sports industry over the last 2 or 3 years, there are, as I said, events and rights holders and clubs and governing bodies who are going to be mitigating against kind of future risk. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are people will oversee their contracts going forward and adding some extra clauses.
Absolutely.
When you're working with the athletes and you're representing athletes, are you also acting kind of as their agent as well?
So we absolutely are not their agent. So my background is I was a sports agent for a number of years. I represented talent at a very kind of reputable football agency, and then moved across into the kind of the commercial side of sport at a company called Lagardère Sports, who are now known as Sport 5. And then within our current role, so we absolutely are not agents. We actually work alongside either the talent's agents. We work with talent directly. We work alongside their advisory team on deals. So our role is not to replace the agent, but it's almost to work in partnership with the agent. Or if the talent wants to work with us directly, then they are more than capable and always and often willing to. But we would always kind of seek approval from their agent in the knowledge of understanding what our role is within that. So where we actually work with talent is twofold. So as I alluded to earlier, where our value add offering as a legal services provider is we kind of split our role into two. So we have our kind of legal team who are doing all relevant kind of reviewing a contract and drafting contracts and doing all the relevant kind of legal work around deals. And then you have myself, who sits as a non-legal commercial advisor within our team, where I essentially help to manage, broker, negotiate deals based on previous experience, but also provide commercial advice around deals that sometimes you may not typically get from a law firm, or you may not get from your lawyer. So that's where I kind of complement our legal team very well, and where again we work with it. So we almost sit at that kind of point between legal advisor, agent, and then we kind of sit. I sit kind of in the middle of those two elements, and that's when we're working talent side. And obviously, when we're working brand or kind of agency side or kind of startup side, then we're purely working on their behalf, providing commercial advice around the deal as to what should a deal with an athlete look like, what suite of rights should we be looking to get from them if we're going to do a brand ambassador deal, what's par value. As I said, what suite of commercial rights should we get? How many content appearances? How many social media posts? What intellectual property are we able to use? Is there any commercial negotiation around royalty models and revenue shares on specific lines of product, and so on and so forth? So on the talent side, we, yes, absolutely work alongside their agents as opposed to acting as their agent. And then obviously on working kind of either brand or business side, we very much kind of utilize our experience of working with athletes and working for talent in helping them to understand and shape what a deal should look like.
That's super interesting, and it's so great to hear how diverse the job is. And you say you work directly with the talent or with the startup. I mean, it's very interesting to see the different aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think where the industry has slightly shifted is historically you would get very traditional kind of brand deals with talent, right? So you would have Nike, you would have Coca-Cola, you would have Rolex, etc., partnering with talent. And absolutely that still forms a large part of kind of the traditional so-called brand ambassador industry, brand endorsement deals with talent. You see it across the globe. Obviously, we know who the high-profile athletes are who command significant rights fees to become ambassadors for these very well-known blue-chip brands. Where things are slightly evolving is that earlier stage businesses, challenger brand startups are now finding more creative ways to work with talent. And as their trusted both legal provider and also commercial advisor, we are there not just to make sure that the deal is sound from a legal perspective, but also to make sure that they get the best bang for their buck as such from a commercial perspective in understanding the nuances around what that deal looks like. Deals with talent are very different depending on who the athlete is, what sport they're involved in. If they play for a club, you obviously have to take into account who the club's partners are in their image rights deals for their club. So there are so many factors at play when it comes to a deal that it's not just simply a case of, as you say, reviewing a contract, looking at the so-called legal jargon and nothing else. It's very much acting as a kind of a wider business and commercial advisor to either the athlete or the brand in making sure that the deal is sound from a commercial perspective as well.
That's what makes it interesting also, right?
Absolutely, 100%. So yeah, it's if the day job was simply just checking contracts and as I said, reading through clauses, then it's suited to certain types of law, but working with athletes, that's certainly not the case. So yeah, absolutely. Each day is different, which is always a good thing.
You mentioned in the beginning also, in addition to your work at JMW, you also do some work for Barn Door. What is that, and what do you do there?
So the kind of the backstory to Barn Door is very interesting. So the founder of the platform, and I'll obviously explain what it is in a second, but this will kind of provide a backstory to why the platform was launched. And it's a business that I now lead and manage out of JMW. So the founder was, he's a board member of our firm. He's a commercial litigator by trade. And he had a core client base of two categories of clients, basically. One was sports stars and one was entrepreneurs. And one morning he had a meeting with an entrepreneur, and the founder of this startup business had created a really innovative piece of wearable technology that would fit inside a boxing glove. So it was like a chip that would measure punch data, speed, how many punches you throw within a certain amount of time, et cetera, et cetera. And this founder specifically was looking for two things. The first was investment to help obviously take the business to market and so on. And the second was brand awareness. So obviously, as a business in the boxing industry, he thought that a boxer would provide or be the perfect brand ambassador for the business, basically. The very same afternoon, he was with another client of his, which was a boxer coming up to retirement, who was having a conversation with him saying, don't really know what I want to do next. I'm coming up to retirement. I want to get involved in a few projects. And there was the light bulb moment for the founder of Barn Door to say, well, I was with this founder this morning, boxing startup. Why don't I connect you? They're looking for investment and they're looking for a boxer as an brand ambassador. And that connection was the start of what Barn Door is today. And what Barn Door now is a confidential online platform that as of today has 217 athletes on it across 27 different sports. They're young, current, retired, they're male, female. And it's everything from Premier League footballers through to, we've got England Rugby Union Cricket World Cup winners. We've got 75 Olympians and Paralympians. And the whole premise behind the platform is that we want to help athletes prepare for their life beyond sport so that when they retire, they don't fall into, sadly, the problems on transition that we're all too familiar with when it comes to talent. And the way that we do that is by connecting them to new business and active commercial opportunities. And I use those terms loosely, very deliberately, but it typically breaks down into one of four types of deal structure. So the first is investment into early stage businesses. They are businesses, using the example I just gave, in sectors that are going to resonate with the athletes, right? So it's sports technology, it's health tech, it's fitness, nutrition, media, esports, etc. The second is traditional brand ambassador work that obviously we spoke about earlier. The offshoot of that, which is something I'm sure we'll speak about later down the line today, is IP equity deals. So a huge trend now is early stage businesses looking to work with athletes. They can't afford to pay them. How do they incentivize them? They'll look at deals structured around equity relative to the image rights value of that athlete, obviously geared against specific contractual obligations, KPIs, and so on. And then the final one is the strategic advisory role. So that's not kind of saying, hey, I've been in business 30 years, here's my values and non-exec. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is athletes have two huge value adds beyond just the kind of consumer facing kind of brand ambassador piece. And that's one, they have a very powerful contact book and network that if they know how to utilize properly can be hugely valuable to early stage businesses. And secondly, they've got an industry expertise. So whilst they can't advise on tech behind a product, as an example, if I've got a wearable piece of technology, they can certainly advise on the type of data that they feel as an elite level athlete should be captured, or if it's a product, if it's a recovery product, as an example, they can advise on their recovery regime as an elite level athlete, whether it's a boxer or a footballer or a rugby player, to help with new product development, right? So they have huge value add in a strategic advisory capacity beyond purely the front facing element. So that's kind of where that fourth kind of strategic advisory piece comes in. So in essence, we have our athletes, we have a whole load of early stage businesses and challenger brands within the sectors that I spoke about. And Barn Door essentially is the platform and the matchmaker in the middle that essentially decides who's compatible. So in a really crude way, I suppose it's like a dating website for sports stars and entrepreneurs, in that we know who our athletes are, what they want, and we know who our businesses are and what they want. And we ultimately connect the two sides together. And that's essentially how Barn Door operates. That's what it is. Barn Door is wholly owned by JMW. So it's a platform, it's a brand name under the JMW banner. And our revenue model is aligned to both us as a law firm and myself as a commercial advisor to obviously talent or startup businesses, as we've discussed.
That's very interesting. And it sounds a little bit like a dragon's den that they go and invest in a startup.
Yeah, in some way it is, absolutely. It's, as I said earlier, it's a really interesting trend now where you're seeing athletes want to get involved in startups and they're getting approached by businesses all the time. And what we're trying to provide is a network of opportunity that's going to provide huge value for them, not obviously necessarily just financially. Everyone knows the risks associated with obviously startup businesses, but also provide value in terms of utilizing their time and their image. So athletes can have investments in all sorts of places, whether it's real estate, whether it's discretionary fund management with their financial advisors, but putting their kind of time and their image or potentially their capital into startups is great because they can kind of touch it, smell it, and they can feel it. It's often businesses that they use themselves. Obviously, athletes are at the forefront of like modern technology in sport, so they get to see all the kind of the cool tech coming out of places all across the world, whether it's them wearing Whoop bands or heart rate monitors or Aura rings or new kind of nutritional supplements, or obviously, as we know, they're huge gamers, so they know the esports industry well. So it's something that actually resonates with them and something that they understand. And for when they come to retirement, obviously, for them to hold, whether it's board positions or ambassadorial roles within these businesses, helping them to grow, it provides that value for them in not just their current playing career, but also in their retirement too. So it's hugely valuable to them. And we ultimately want to kind of help with that.
I think it's a great thing because it's first of all an investment for them if everything goes well, but it's also something to do, which is two things that the athletes struggle with after their career. What will they do now? And in a recent episode, we were speaking about investing for athletes. I mean, the different types, stocks and bonds and NFTs and Bitcoins, you name it. And this is just another type of investment. But as you said also that it requires a little bit more of engagement from their side, maybe.
Exactly. And I mean, you've touched on it there, right? NFTs, Bitcoin, crypto, they get approached about anything and everything. And it's funny because often the misconception with us is that we're an investment platform. We're absolutely not. So obviously with Barn Door being wholly owned by a law firm, we're very strictly regulated in what we can and can't do. So we spoke earlier about, are we agents? Do we replace the role of the agent? Absolutely not. In the same way that we don't give financial advice, right? So we're not regulated to do so. We don't manage funds. We don't give investment advice. So we'll then obviously work with their investment managers or with the talent directly, and we'll help them to understand the risks associated, but we'll never advise them on those deals. But what we're doing is we're working with them to, we see a lot of deal flow. So we are involved in a very specific ecosystem, which is the sports technology ecosystem, which is a fascinating world to be a part of. But it means that we get very good access to deal flow, hence why we work with VCs and angels and high net worth on our deals as well. And what we're providing for the athlete is that network of opportunity. We understand the athletes, we understand what they're looking for. And you're absolutely right that it's a case of they see all the trends, they hear all the trends, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, whether it's being approached. And yeah, as I was saying, like people often approach us and go, hey, footballers are rich, let's get them to invest in my business. And My answer to everyone is always the same, that the value that athletes drive to businesses has got nothing to do with their capital, because if these businesses want strategic capital, then they're better off going to VCs, private equity, angels, high net worth from a capital perspective. But what the athletes bring that these other people don't bring is the credibility, the trust, the authenticity, the brand awareness, the advice as an elite level athlete, and their experience within that. And yes, if they put skin in the game, obviously it's great and it's going to help them obviously further down the line if the business succeeds. But it shouldn't be the only part of working with athletes. Like, if you're going to work with an athlete, you want to utilize working with them beyond them simply just being a kind of a soft investor in the business and never hearing from them again. It absolutely needs to be more of a strategic partnership and a commercial partnership beyond just potentially their capital resource.
This episode is sponsored by InSport Education, the online business school for sport. They offer a range of different courses, for example, Foundations of Sport Business, Private Equity in Sport, and much, much more. As a listener to this podcast, you get 10% off all of their courses using the code SPORTSMANAGEMENTPODCAST10. Click the link in the description below and sign up today.
I know you have worked with Anthony Joshua on some deal, which for those who doesn't know is one of the best boxers ever. What were you working with him?
So the deal with AJ is actually a perfect example of how kind of JMW, Bond, or work with talent, as I alluded to earlier. So in that scenario, we represented the startup business. So that startup business is a business called Pulse. They are a business that's in the muscle recovery technology sector. So they do things like the vibrating massage guns, the foam rollers. They've got other products like peanut balls and other new products that are coming out to market very shortly. Obviously in a very consumer kind of focused sector, in a sector that's very hot at the moment. So they came to us initially on the premise of wanting to work with athletes. The founder's got a phenomenal story in the sense that he actually approached AJ a number of years ago when he went down to Sheffield to the GB boxing camp and kind of waited. That kind of traditional founder story of waiting for that kind of till the lights switch off and there's only a cleaner left in the room, and went to approach AJ and kind of said, these are our products, hope you like them. We think that they'll help you on your journey, etc. And kind of like built a soft relationship over the years. And then when we were engaged by Pulse, it was essentially to do a number of things. One, it was to help them do deals with talent. The second was to grow their business in sport. So we've since helped them to do deals with a number of Premier League football clubs, Premiership rugby clubs, national governing bodies. They're currently going through a funding round and a whole host of other work. And on the deal specifically with AJ, it got to the point where AJ was using these products daily. Pulse were raising capital and they wanted their kind of global brand ambassador. So that's when kind of Paul, the founder, AJ, and obviously us working alongside the business, had a conversation to say, hey, why don't we do a deal? What was brilliant about that deal was, as I said, it was fully authentic because AJ had been using the products for 4 years. And it wasn't just a case of, we're going to ask you to invest, we're going to offer you some equity, we want you as a brand ambassador, we want you as a strategic advisor, simply just because you're Anthony Joshua, one of the world's most famous athletes, right? It was very much a case of the product validation was there, the authenticity was there, and all of that kind of stuff, which comes out in the content that we've created with him. So it was a really interesting deal across that full suite of what I spoke about earlier. So he's an investor in the business, he's a brand ambassador, and he's a strategic advisor advising on new product development, introducing the business into his network, which includes retail, it includes a whole load of other areas. So it's the perfect example of how a consumer-facing startup business that's on a very positive upward growth trajectory can work with a very high-profile, relevant athlete in a very specific sector and create a phenomenal partnership based around kind of a real-life example as such, based around trust, credibility, authenticity, that then plugs out into obviously the wider commercial market to enable both the business to grow and also obviously hopefully enable AJ's startup portfolio to grow as well.
Yeah. The authenticity there, I think, is very important because customers nowadays, they see right through if someone is not legit with what they are selling. So has that sometime been an issue if you see you have a company, you have the athletes, but you just don't see like the connection?
Yeah, and in that scenario, we'll be very clear to say you've got to be very careful with the content you put out because, as you say, yeah, I mean, you've seen it recently with all the footballers' NFTs, right? It's like you can tell what's behind the deal, and often you'll sometimes get athletes, whether current or retired, endorsing all sorts of different brands and businesses where you know the only reason that they're doing it is because of the paycheck at the end. You know that the social media post that's been written has been written by their team, not them. So it's critically important now that in the modern consumer, whether it's a millennial, it's a Gen Z or whoever it might be, their attitude to this stuff is very different. They see, as you say, they see right through it. So it's a piece of advice that we always give, but it's imperative that there's actually a genuine connection there between the business or the brand and the athlete. Otherwise, there's no traction, there's no ROI for the business, and for the athlete, it's great from obviously potentially from a financial perspective, but it does nothing for their kind of, I suppose, IP value in the long term. And if you chase money, it potentially can preclude you from other potential brand partners in a similar category or even future categories. If who knows what's going to happen, as an example, to the kind of the NFT world, right? And you partner with the wrong brand, it can potentially be very damaging longer term. So there's a whole load of due diligence that now needs to be done when it comes to kind of these brand ambassador deals that historically wasn't as necessary.
You said the IP value. Can you elaborate a little bit on what is that exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the intellectual property value of an athlete comes in a whole load of different forms. So if you were to read a contract and you were to read a brand ambassador contract with a talent deal, it would say use of athlete IP, or if it was a club deal, it would say use of club IP. What that typically relates to from a talent perspective is the name of the athlete, the image of the athlete, the voice of the athlete, the likeness of the athlete, and so on. So when you do a deal with all the logo of the athlete and so on, and the same applies to the club, right? It's the club logo, it's the utilization of the club's intellectual property in different forms, whether it's on packaging, whether it's on Anthony Joshua on a Lucozade bottle as an example, and so on. All of that is the intellectual property of an athlete. And historically, I suppose athlete IP has just very much been seen in the context of what we were speaking about earlier, which is those traditional brand ambassador deals where you see an athlete on a TV advertisement advertising a brand. The world has changed, as we know, with social media and different kind of content formats and so on, such that the use of an athlete's IP spreads so much further than it ever has, because you've got things like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and a whole load of other kind of content mediums. So when you're doing a deal with someone who's very high profile, that the intellectual property of that athlete is clearly hugely valuable and needs to be protected at all costs. So it's imperative within any contract that you're doing, as I said, as on behalf of either a club or talent, that intellectual property is protected at all costs. And whoever the kind of the so-called rights holder is in that scenario, whether it's the club or the athlete, they will make sure that there are very stringent guidelines as to where their intellectual property can be used. And then that will be detailed very specifically within a contract. All
right. So I guess obviously then the IP of Messi is higher than that of a less profile player, and that goes as, I mean, how you evaluate anything. So exactly, and that's where you determine the value, right? So when someone says David Beckham got paid X many millions for endorsing whatever brand it might be, that's referring to his intellectual property value, and there will be a kind of a baseline value for that athlete's IP, but then the more, in essence, the way to look at it is athlete time is money. So the more you want to utilize them, the more you want to do with them, the more it's going to cost you. So a traditional brand ambassador deal might be a 12-month or a 24-month deal where you get one content appearance a year. So you get to shoot some content with the athlete, you get use of their IP, you get maybe one, and I'm talking in very kind of generic terms here, one social media post a month. They might turn up for a personal appearance for a certain PR event, and a whole load of other ancillary
rights, maybe like a competition and giveaway, some memorabilia, some tickets to an event, or so on and so forth. And that would typically be your framework. Now, if you were a brand and you said, actually, look at it as if you're going to the supermarket with a prepaid shopping card, and everything in the supermarket has a different value. You know how much you've got to spend. Certain things cost more than others, right? So if you wanted to do an extra content appearance, it's going to cost you a lot more than simply if you just want another signed shirt or a signed boxing glove, as an example. Or if you want 3 social media posts instead of 1 a month, clearly it's going to cost you more money. So there are so many metrics to define athlete IP, and you do a whole load of benchmarking geared towards how many social media followers they've got, obviously how high profile they are, the club that they play for, and so on and so forth. And that's ultimately how you kind of come to a kind of a par value, I suppose, based on a traditional deal for what an athlete's IP is worth. And as you say, you've got kind of the tier 1 superstars up here who command significant rights fees. And then you've got tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc., etc.
I read that Michael Jordan made the majority of his net worth after, or like actually outside of his basketball career. So what he got paid in NBA is, way less than what he made outside with his endorsement deals, etc.
Yeah, it's one of the most famous examples, and I mean he was a very smart man when when Nike obviously came to him with a licensing deal for Air Jordans, but obviously beyond just simply that deal that everyone knows about, he's been hugely successful across a whole load of different areas within business. And he was probably, I suppose, we're kind of talking about the 1990s there, right? And if you look at it now, if you kind of do some digging around, whether it's sadly Kobe Bryant before he passed away, but you've got Kevin Durant, you've got LeBron James, you've got Serena Williams with her own venture capital fund. They've recently done another fundraise. Aaron Rodgers has got his RX3 fund. So you've got, in that scenario, you've got a whole load of athletes now who are actually kind of strategically partnering themselves with venture capital firms and other financial institutions to invest with them and alongside them, using kind of the example I gave before, that you've got kind of these very well experienced venture capital firms investing into assets that they probably would be anyway, but now they've got the added value of having athletes alongside them that they can then go and endorse, become ambassadors for, help to share their very significant network and profile. And it's kind of becoming trendy to be an athlete investor. Like the athlete as a venture capitalist is becoming more and more trendy. In the UK, you see more, I suppose, more athletes as kind of equivalent to angel investors, where they'll get involved in specific deals. There aren't any yet that have kind of set up their own VC fund in the same way that those in the US have. There are, I mean, I sit as an advisor to an investment company in the UK who have athletes as kind of co-investors within their top co. They deploy assets into consumer-facing businesses within sport. So they are kind of dipping their toe in, but there's none that have kind of formally launched a fund in the same way that those in the US have. And I've got no doubt it will happen. And I kind of coined the term the golden triangle when it comes to these deals, because you've got very high quality early stage business kind of at the point of the triangle. And then you've got the kind of traditional institutional investors, which is the VCs, the private equity houses, on kind of, let's call it the bottom right of the triangle. And then the bottom left, you've got the athletes, and you join those three things together and you've suddenly got a very powerful combination for the right businesses.
Definitely. So such an interesting topic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a topic that's only going one way as well. Like you're going to start to see it more and more. I think as athletes become more savvy to the fact that they can add huge value to these businesses, it's kind of seen as a bit sexier. It's a bit more glamorous than kind of traditional. You spoke earlier about like bonds and different investments from a discretionary standpoint. And don't get me wrong, athletes will always have those, and they always should have those, because they need the kind of traditional investments to provide value for them in retirement. It's as safe and secure as it's going to be. They all often have a significant interest in real estate. And I suppose what the startup world gives them is kind of a whether it's 5%, 10% of their portfolio. It provides them with an opportunity not just to potentially put some cash into these businesses, but as I said earlier, put some time into it and help these businesses to grow. And it gives them something to talk about in the changing room, and it gives them something to talk about, and also helps them to grow their network. They want to learn from founders. They want to learn from seasoned executives within finance, within law, and other kind of industry execs beyond just kind of simply their athlete network. They're always looking to grow their, not just obviously their portfolio, but also grow their network, right? And they want to learn from different people, just like business people want to learn from athletes and other kind of high profile, whether it's actors, musicians, celebrities, etc. So yeah, super interesting and an area that I'm super passionate about.
I'm happy to hear that. And speaking of you and your career, how did your career in sports start? And just a short story of from how it started up until today.
Sure. So I kind of always knew I wanted to work in sport. I've kind of played sport all throughout my life, and I suppose I didn't necessarily go down the traditional route of kind of studying anything sports related at university. So I actually did a history degree at university with the idea that, well, one, I was passionate about the topic, or various topics obviously within that. And secondly, I knew it would leave my options open. So I knew I wasn't going to be a doctor. And doing a history degree kind of gave me that time to, I suppose, figure out what I wanted to do. The traditional route for me would have been probably to do a law conversion straight from university, qualify as a lawyer, and then slowly inch towards the sports world over the kind of course of the next 5 or 10 years. But I kind of said to myself, I know I want to work in sport, let's do it straight away. So tailored my work experience whilst I was at university. So I did work experience in Manchester United. I did a very well-known internship at IMG, which was like an 8-week summer internship where I worked within a couple of departments at IMG, which set me up really nicely to start kind of growing my network. And then kind of spoke to a few people within the sports world and kind of settled on the idea of representing athletes and working within football as a football agent would be a brilliant thing to do. And thankfully, I had a contact who was the chairman of the football agency I ended up working for. Coincidentally, bumped into him on holiday, and we had a coffee. We had lunch the next day. He then offered me some work experience in the Easter of my final year of university, did that, and then the rest is history, as they say. So that's kind of how I fell into the sports world straight out of university, basically.
I have read that you have quite some skills as an athlete as well, both in football, golf, and tennis. Is that true?
I don't know how high that skill level is, but no, I played to a kind of an okay level, a very amateur level, I should add. But no, I kind of represented school teams in football and tennis. Played football at university for the university team. Was president of the university football club. I've always been known as a fair weather sportsman, so you'll find me playing very well during the months of kind of April to August, and then the winter not so much. But no, I still play 11-a-side football on a Sunday. I play golf and tennis in my summer. So yeah, I'm an avid sports both player and obviously as a fan as well. So yeah, it's something that obviously I'm hugely passionate about, not just in my professional career, but outside as well.
I see the Alex Ferguson book behind you. Is football the main sport?
Yeah, I'd say that, yeah, football is kind of my number one sport. And then I think closely followed, well, golf will definitely be kind of second, and then tennis third. But yeah, I mean, I'm into obviously F1, rugby, cricket.
Everyone is into F1 after Drive to Survive.
Yeah, it's crazy. I've even got my sister messaging me at the weekend saying like she's got young kids and she's up early with the kids and she's there watching the Australian Grand Prix and telling why I'm waking up and being told who's won it. So yeah, and that's all come from her watching first 2 seasons of Drive to Survive with her husband. So yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, the viewing figures in the US as a result of Drive to Survive, who are now watching. I mean, you've probably seen the news about the media rights for F1 in the US, and when you look at what's being paid currently compared to what's being touted at the moment, I think a large proportion of that should be attributed to Netflix and Drive to Survive, because it's unbelievable. But it just shows the power of content, right? So
definitely,
it shows that it works.
Yeah, and the behind the scene contents, especially that's what the fans want to see.
Exactly, absolutely. They want to get to know. I think with like the all or nothings with talent or with clubs as an example, it's slightly different, because they just kind of want to see what actually goes on behind the scenes, and they want to see obviously like what goes on between players and managers and all this kind of stuff. What do players do in the spare time and this kind of thing. Whereas I think what's really interesting about the Drive to Survive element is there is so much that goes into Formula One, and it's just a completely eye-opening experience to see everything that goes into a race weekend, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's obviously a very glamorous world. So it's a great watch.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Approaching the end here, is there something that I haven't asked you that you feel is important to mention?
So something you've not asked me that I think was important. I don't think so. I think we've covered. I think, as I said earlier, the area that I'm super kind of passionate about, and the area that I see real kind of growth in, is the value that athletes are driving to kind of early stage businesses. And it's probably one of my frustrations that in the UK and Europe, it doesn't necessarily follow the US model currently, but it will do in a few years, which is the same as a lot of things, right? It's the same as the investment landscape. The startup world in the US was developed before it was in the UK and Europe. And it's the same with athletes getting involved in these businesses. And I think as I said, there's often a misconception that athletes can't or don't provide or drive the value to businesses that they could. And I think the more founders that I work with, the more founders realize that working with talent is actually really valuable. And yeah, we've not necessarily touched on like the trends within the sports technology ecosystem that are attributable or applicable for athletes over the course of the next 5 years, of which there's numerous. You've obviously touched on NFTs and other kind of new technologies, but we kind of, again, we touched on content, right, with Netflix Drive to Survive. So there's so many areas now within this kind of whole ecosystem that we just weren't even in the conversation 5 years ago. And it's just going to be fascinating to see more success stories, see more athletes get involved with a number of these businesses, and you'll see that kind of into kind of link between, or I suppose you'll see athletes working more at the intersection of sports media technology way more than you ever did within the startup world. And it's definitely something that we should all keep an eye on, including all the listeners and yourself, Marcus, and obviously me too. So yeah, all very exciting.
Definitely. So much is happening. Maybe we need to do a part 2 here later down the road, see what has happened since.
Would love to. And even maybe get an athlete on to talk about their investments as well.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. And it's a great segue into my next question, which is also the last one. It's, if you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who would you choose?
So it would definitely be, I think you've probably mentioned him actually, because we've been talking about athletes as investors and successful athletes, investors. How did they do it? How did they become as successful as they did? What was their light bulb moment during their career to enable them to get involved in all their ventures outside? And you mentioned Michael Jordan, right? And he's the most successful of them all. So why not shoot for the stars? Excuse the pun. So yeah,
definitely.
Why not?
In a previous episode, they suggested Tiger Woods, so I have some work to do here.
Tiger Woods certainly be. I mean, the guys. I've got 3 sporting kind of heroes, and Tiger Woods is in those 3, and just the guy's mental resilience and mental strength is just remarkable. So yeah, Tiger wouldn't be a bad one. Then
I need the other 2 as well.
Rafael Nadal. So you can see the theme here with kind of like amazing competitors, and being a Man United fan and being lucky enough to watch Cristiano Ronaldo for a large proportion of the kind of peak of his early years was just it was unbelievable. So yeah, Ronaldo, Rafa Nadal, and Tiger Woods are my kind of 3 sporting pantheon greats. So yeah.
That's a good list.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ben, Peppi, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Sports Management Podcast.
Pleasure, and great to talk to you, Marcus. Hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.